Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" He said to them, "It was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery." His disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let everyone accept this who can." Then little children were being brought to him in order that he might lay hands on them and pray. The disciples spoke sternly to those who brought them, but Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs." And he laid his hands on them and went on his way. This passage from the Gospel of Matthew is filled with hot spots just waiting to erupt. Thin ice just barely keeping us out of a frigid pond, and those single straws just heavy enough to finally break the back of that camel. From divorce to adultery, from eunuchs to the place of children in the imminent Christian culture, there are any number of topics here that warrant entire sermons or even series of sermons. I've also really baited the hook with an ambiguous title, Gendered Christ Following. I want to recognize that there are many directions that could go that would be very valuable conversations among modern faith communities. But what I'm here to talk about today is the relationship between church and gender in modern culture, specifically transgender and intersex people. Now, it may be also easy to think that I, as a transgender person, am going to focus just on what Christ had to say about eunuchs in this passage, and I promise you I'm not going to disappoint you on that. But I hope by the time we are done, you'll see a much larger picture emerging from the whole scope of the life and teaching of Christ and of the early church. Now, to get to that point, I would like to share a little of my own story, specifically about my journey with gender and the impact that it has had on my relationship with God and my relationship with the church. And in the process of that, I'll be introducing you to some terms, some words that you may or may not be familiar with. But either way, even if you had heard them, it's possible, maybe even likely, that no one has ever really taken the time to explain what they mean and how they are relevant to this conversation in our current times. I also want to share a quick analogy that I have found useful in understanding and explaining the biological dynamics of gender, something that is a little more complex than we usually take for granted. And then from that point, we'll take a short exegetical dive into the Matthew passage. So, deep breath, keep listening while you warm up your coffee, call grandma and grandpa and the neighbors over because you know they're going to want to hear this too. Get yourself comfy and let's get to it. By all outward appearances, my early adult life was rather amazing. I'd studied at Moody Bible Institute, spent some time in the Christian music industry. I was married with a wonderful young family. I was looking forward to a simple career in churches and not-for-profit ministries. But all the while, there was a whole lot more going on underneath the surface. In my mid-30s, I was diagnosed with gender identity disorder. Now, since then, the powers that be have changed the name of this diagnosis to gender dysphoria. And this diagnosis came about because I have experienced persistent depression, anxiety, rooted in questions about my gender identity. Now, there's a few terms I should probably already define. Gender dysphoria is the result of confusion between the gender one is assigned at birth and the gender one more closely relates to in their own personal way. Gender identity is how we describe the gender that the individual more closely recognizes as their own. Now, it's important to note here that not all people who experience gender dysphoria are transgender. Transgender describes the life experience of either living with gender dysphoria in the context of one's assigned gender, or the process of transitioning from socially identifying as one gender to another, or in some cases to neither or both genders. So, just so the rest of you don't feel left out, cisgender is how we describe people whose gender identity matches or is the same, cis being Latin for same, as what they were assigned at birth. And when I say assigned at birth, what I mean is that when a child is born or a sonogram is taken, there are primary sex characteristics that we observe and recognize, and based on that observation, we decide whether the child is a boy or a girl. The challenge of that is that gender is based on much more than these observable primary sex characteristics. When there is enough of a difference between the varying systems in the body that would normally be labeled as either male or female, it results in what we identify as an intersex condition. So, intersex is a biological or medical term describing the presence of both male and female structures in one person. Now, some of these are identified early because they affect the primary sex characteristics that I just mentioned, that parents and medical professionals are expecting to see develop in a child. But of the known intersex conditions, only a handful of them are that obvious at a young age. So, after a lifetime of dealing with gender dysphoria, in the years of dealing with that diagnosis, I came to a point where life was just unmanageable, in my own opinion. There were unexplained other persistent health issues, other life challenges, taking its toll on our marriage. And after an abandoned suicide plan and subsequent hospital stay in 2014, we made the decision to separate, and I began the process of shifting things in my life. Now, these new lenses allowed for some different perspectives that eventually led to some answers on the medical front as well. And those eventually led to the diagnosis of an intersex condition. So I need to make another distinction here. Not all trans people have a diagnosed intersex condition. Furthermore, not all intersex people have a transgender life experience. There's an overlap between the two, without a doubt, but they are distinct phenomena and both have an impact on how we understand gender as a culture and how we relate to it as a church. So, having just thrown a bunch of new terms at you, I want to take a step back and break down this idea of how biological gender is understood and how it impacts or should impact our approach to gender and gender roles in our communities. And to do that, bear with me here, I'm going to take a look at the history of the printing press. Now, according to the biblical narrative, after the earth had flooded and clouds were receding and sunlight was once again breaking through the atmosphere, water and light combined to display the first visible rainbow. Color had presumably been around since the beginning of creation, but this post-apocalyptic display put color on the map, so to speak. Now fast forward a couple millennia to a shop in Germany, where man and machine were collaborating on an epic step forward in history, the first printing press. Now, despite the presence of color in the world around us, the first press was only capable of presenting either black or white. Ink was either present or not. And even with its limitations, the technology was revolutionary and the result was beautiful. Black and white printing was good. So good, in fact, that most historians credit this innovation with fueling the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. As time pressed on, it was discovered that the white space between the black space could be managed by adding dots in between them and spreading it out in order to give the illusion of gray. Before long, the space between black and white was being mastered by printers around the globe. The simple had become a little more complex and flexible. New arts and expressions emerged, and the world saw that the spectrum between black and white, the grayscale, was good. As even more time passed, printmasters noticed that the primary colors, blue, yellow, and red, could also be printed, each on their own scale, and then blended with multiple passes through a printing press to give the appearance of many colors, even thousands of colors. And of course, the machines became more complex and the products more striking and beautiful. And the world saw that the colors were good. Eventually, artists and technicians alike began looking at the colors of nature and the colors coming off the press and realized that nature was by far outpacing the press. So in an effort to keep up, the three basic colors were replaced by four colors. It's our CMYK. Once again, the machine became more complicated and the product more stunning. And people everywhere saw that the four-color press was good. Eventually, the human eye was aided by computers. And it was noted that by adding even more root colors to the press, the millions of colors generated by a four-color process could become trillions of colors by blending 6, 8, and even more colors, all on their own scale. Magazines, book covers, posters, and billboards began to jump off the pages with deep and vibrant life. In so many ways, the colors were seen as good. Now, the basic point here is this. When we start blending multiple sources, each on their own scale, the potential outcome is enormous. Our understanding of gender has been on a similar trajectory. We started with a simple black and white, based on the external organs, those primary sex characteristics. We now recognize up to 5 different parts of the body that contribute to what of us is male and what is female, or even masculine and feminine. And much like the colors, none of these are binary. All, in one way or another, instead, present themselves somewhere along a scale. They combine to create uncountable expressions of humanity along the complex and beautiful spectrum of gender. Each one special, each one unique, and each one is, in my opinion, an amazing example of God's immense creative power. And my prayer is that we will see them all as good. So without starting to sound like a biology lesson, the 5 areas that we look at are these. Primary sex characteristics, mostly what we observe in the womb or at birth. Secondary sex characteristics, those that develop in the tween and teen years. Chromosomes, and those usually fall under the discipline and research of genetics and geneticists. The endocrine system, which is actually a very complex and involves a lot of different organs and functions. And then finally, brain structure and function. And this is a rapidly emerging field of study and understanding that can actually be a little difficult to keep up with. But now let me roll us back to the passage in Matthew with a question. Why did Jesus take a turn during a conversation about marriage and divorce toward the topic of eunuchs? Now, some might say that it's because eunuchs were not allowed to marry, because of their gender ambiguity and because of their place and function in society. So it's really their perpetual singleness and presumed celibacy that Christ is drawing on here. But this seems a bit unnecessary, though, because he could have easily just said, some people choose to remain unmarried, to be single, etc. The word used here that is translated eunuch refers to a very specific group of people that are grouped together specifically because of the state of their bodies. Now, the Jewish people that Christ was addressing at the time would have been very familiar with some Old Testament laws addressing ritual cleanliness that were very gendered. Leviticus 21 sets out the bodily defects that would make a priest unfit to approach the inner rooms of the temple. And that list includes any damage to male organs and would therefore eliminate eunuchs from being considered worthy of coming into the presence of God. But so as not to leave women out of the day, completely innocent, Leviticus 15 also declares that women are considered unclean during their monthly period. And, like many other issues of ritual cleanliness, takes great pains to describe how that uncleanliness crosses over to anything she touches, or anything that touches her, or anyone she touches, or anyone that touches her. This gendered familiarity with the ritual place of eunuchs in the religious culture would have made them an unlikely example for Christ to draw on when simply looking for an example of singleness and celibacy in a conversation about divorce, remarriage, and adultery. I believe in doing so when he had other options. Christ is drawing on a larger objective of his work, and specifically this, to unother the othered. Now, this conversation about divorce and eunuchs is immediately followed by Christ unothering children and encouraging his disciples to see them as equal heirs to the realm of God. The whole conversation about divorce and marriage started when a group of religious leaders came in with questions for Jesus on the practice of a man being able to give his wife a certificate of divorce under the Mosaic law. Now, as with most questions that came from this particular group of people, what they were really trying to do is see which side of their own debates Jesus would land on and capture him in something that would actually violate the law and consequently give them a reason to spread mistrust and dislike for him. And as was often the case, Jesus answered with neither A nor B, but instead he addresses the deeper question that none of them are willing to ask in the moment. And in this case, I believe the question is this: why do you continue to seek a system that defines and separates you from one another? Now, we live and work in a culture that relies heavily on gender binaries. Part of the reason that my medical conditions went undiagnosed for so many years was that assumptions were made by doctors and practitioners that I was 100% completely male. Now, those assumptions caused doctors to overlook things in my body that were causing pain and problems. Things in our culture, from the American Constitution to the structure and polity of many Christian denominations, rely heavily on this understanding that any one individual is distinctly male or female, and therefore subject to specific roles according to that designation. I recently wrote a paper for a class dealing with dreams and discernments, where I highlighted specific areas that practitioners and therapists and counselors are conditioned to consider that the subconscious expressions of people in their dreams are gendered. For example, if a man dreams something about a woman, it means something different than when a woman dreams something about a woman, and vice versa. These are gendered stereotypes that we have to address and take into consideration when we're dealing with people like myself who don't fit specifically into a gendered box. So the question that has been perplexing me isn't one of social justice, though that's an important conversation. It's not a question of religious rightness or doctrinal integrity surrounding the equality of gender roles in our society, also something that we should address. It's a much more basic question. What does the church expect from someone like me who doesn't fit neatly into either gendered space of male and female? I mentioned earlier that not all trans people have an intersex diagnosis. I also want to take a minute to point out that many intersex conditions can go undiagnosed for a lifetime. If someone is transgender or has a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, but does not have a specific intersex diagnosis, that doesn't necessarily mean that biology isn't impacting their gender identity. Assuming that about a person amounts to little more than an attempt to other them, and usually we other people for the sake of our own comfort. That being said, let's be real for a moment. The gender binary is comfortable for most of you. Shoot, there are times that I even long for the simplicity of it in my work and especially in my relationships. In this scientific and information age, we love to put things into categories. Sorting all of creation into genus and species and families gives us a sense of understanding the unfathomable, of taking the infinite and finding a way to management. And trust me, that's not something I'm trying to take away from people. However, when something or someone presents itself that doesn't fit the categories we have developed and become reliant on, we tend to be much more eager to reject the person and define them as imperfect or unholy or uncomfortable than we are to reconsider the categories themselves, that they might be flawed. I want to encourage us as followers of Christ to be less gendered and more personal as we accept each individual as an ultimate expression of God's immense creativity. Doing this acknowledges that the problem isn't with the way God creates these individuals, but with the boxes we seek to put them in for our own comfort and peace of mind. Now, I'm a romantic at heart, and sunrises and sunsets will always capture my imagination and speak to my soul. But I remember it being pointed out to me that dawn and dusk, the gradual shift from dark to light, and then from light back to dark again, each challenge the binary of day and night. Likewise, the frog and its fellow amphibians challenge the boxes of land creatures and water creatures. Now, I am grateful that my intersex diagnosis and my transgender experience didn't end my relationship with God, but instead have driven me to new depths and intimacy with God. Unfortunately, that's not what many of my siblings have experienced, and much of that, I believe, is more a reflection of the church than it is of God's nature and God's self. My hope and prayer for us as a church is that we are able to see individual reflections of the divine image more than we simply see others. And also that we don't all have to suffer, as I have suffered, in order to experience the depth and breadth of the divine in this way. Will you join me in that prayer? Amen.